Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in company law. In this lesson, we are actually going to start to move on to looking at the company itself, the nature of the company itself, and the different types of companies that we can actually think about in English law. So what we're going to do in this lesson specifically is talk about the delineation that is made between the public company versus the private company. What are the two main differences? How does the Companies Act from 2006 actually highlight these differences? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of having one corporate structure versus a different corporate structure? This is just carrying on from the previous lesson in which we discussed and spent a little bit of time talking about the various different kinds of business structures which exist that someone can perform business with. We talked about, for example, of course, the idea of the sole trader, the sole proprietorship. Then we spoke a little bit about the nature of the partnership, and then we finally focused on the nature of the company and the concept of incorporation. So these were the sort of three major elements of company law that we examined in the previous video. This lesson is going to look and to start to focus on the latter of these three. And for the most part, for the rest of this course, for the rest of this series of lessons, we are going to be talking exclusively about the nature of the company. And we're going to be talking about all the different elements of the company and the way in which law regulates companies. So, in terms of delineating companies, there are various different ways in which we can distinguish these different forms of business structures. For example, a company may be public or private. It may exist with various different types of liability. You can have unlimited liability corporations as well as limited liability corporations, the latter of which being far more popular than the former. We could talk about the fact that there are certain requirements for companies in certain industries and in certain areas. So there are different, for example, share capital requirements, all of which are the different forms of delineation. The most important of these delineations, arguably, is this distinction between the idea of the public company on the one hand and the private company on the other. When a new company is created, one of the first considerations that a new business owner ought to take into account and ought to think about is the distinction that ought to be had between the public company and the private company, whether or not they want their business to be public or whether they want their business to be private. There are a number of substantive differences between the two. For example, when we think about the definition of a private company, we see that according to Section 4, subsection 1 of the 2006 Companies Act, it defines a private company as a company which is not a public company. Not very helpful, okay? But it's okay, because what we can do is just go and ask the question, okay, well, if a private company is simply just something that isn't a public company, what then is a public company? And then by ascertaining the nature of what a public company is, we can come to a number of distinctions and determinations about the two. So forget about the definition of a private company, because Section 4.1 of the Companies Act isn't particularly very helpful in defining what a private company is, because it just says a private company is just not a public company. Instead, though, let's look at the definition of a public company, which is found in Section 4, subsection 2 of the Companies Act. And it defines a public company as a company which is either limited by shares or limited by guarantee, whose certificate of incorporation states that it is defined as a public company. So that's really what the definition of a public company is. But there's more to it than that. Okay, it's more to it than just having a company which is limited by shares or guarantee that has a certificate of incorporation which states that it is defined as a public company. That seems, again, a little bit counterintuitive, or at least a little bit basic in terms of an understanding of what actually is a public company. The requirements for a public company, then, are a little bit more complicated. When one wishes to create a public company, they must adhere to a number of share capital requirements. There has to be an allotted share capital of at least £50,000 in the case of a public company. You can contrast this, for example, with a private company in which the only requirement for share capital is that there is some value that can be measured in money, which means that you could have theoretically 1 penny being a share capital requirement and establishment for a private company. In fact, the vast majority of private companies are often very bog standard 1 shareholder and £1 share capital companies, in which that is the basic structure of these sort of single people companies. According to Section 154 of the 2006 Companies Act, a public company must have at least 2 company directors. This is again contrasted with a private company in which there is only the requirement that there be 1 company director. You don't need 2 company directors to run a private corporation. And so there we go. That's another example of their suggesting a public company, private company divide. In addition to this, the main differences that we can think about, at least conceptually, and at least from the perspective of corporate finance and financial markets, is that a public company has the ability to offer its shares to the public at large. So this is something known as listing, in which you can have an individual company that is a public company that can be offering shares onto an exchange market, like a stock exchange, for example. These are companies which are public, which are listed. Okay, the process of taking a public company into this listing process involves the process of offering shares to the public for the first time. This is known as an IPO, an initial public offering, and is quite a long and arduous process in which a lot of information about the company is ascertained. A lot of work is done by law firms and by accountancy firms to essentially create an initial public offering that values the company in a way which is obviously reasonable and acceptable for the actual ascertained value of that business itself. And an IPO is obviously a very, very important thing. Another main difference that we can see between a public company and a private company is the suffix that is required at the end of them. Public companies require the suffix of PLC, whereas private companies require to have either an LTD or limited. Again, LTD referring to limited as well. You have the choice, if you are somebody who is making a private company, whether or not you want to have your private company have LTD at the end of it, or you want to have limited at the end as your suffix. And there you go. So those were the basic differences, the major differences between a public company and a private company. Fundamentally then, we looked at what is the share capital requirements for the creation of a public company versus a private one, which is of course 50,000 versus any money that is above a penny for public and private companies. We noted that another difference involves the fact that there is a suffix of limited versus PLC at the end of public and private companies. You have to have 2 company directors if you are a public company. And there is also the ability for public companies to offer shares to the public through the acquisition of an IPO. Again, this is something that is not available for that of a private company. A good textbook to have a look at a bit more detail at the nature of the public versus the private company is the Core Text series by Dignam and Lowry on company law from 2022. This really gets into the weeds of the nature of the private corporation, the nature of limited liability, the nature of corporate personality, all of which are conversations and ideas and debates that we're going to be taking and looking at in more detail in future lessons time.